This section is about the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. And if you remember Jacob Coxey's idea of creating public jobs with printed money, welcome to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. Coxey's idea in 1894 was considered not feasible, ridiculous, whereas Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal is considered the cure of the Great Depression. Now, the great debate is whether the New Deal actually ended the Great Depression. That is an argument, and depending on which side of the argument that you argue, tells a lot about your politics and much about you. But most people argue that either the New Deal did cure the Great Depression's problems or it did not cure it. Many people that say that the New Deal did not end the Great Depression argue that World War II actually ended the Great Depression. One thing that Franklin Roosevelt realized that he had to do was restore confidence in America, in American people. And Franklin Roosevelt is going to be a master of using the radio. Harding was not a master of the radio. Coolidge definitely wasn't. He was a great speaker, man of few words. And Hoover had a monotone voice. He never really truly could use the radio effectively. Franklin Roosevelt was a master using the radio, and his radio broadcasts were called fireside chats. Now, what he wanted to do was relieve the hurt of the American people, to restore confidence, recovery, restore the economy, and reform, try to prevent future depressions. These are called the 3 R's of the New Deal. When Roosevelt was elected in 1932, so were the Democrats. There were a large majority of Democrats in the House and the Senate. And with the landslide victory that he believed he had a mandate from the people to do anything that he wanted. And he is going to set a record for the amount of legislation passed in the first 100 days of his office. This amount of the legislation has left a yardstick that all future presidents after Franklin Roosevelt were measured by. If we were to have a new president come January the 20th of 2021, or any year, they will be measured what can they get accomplished in the first 100 days. And that measuring rod was left by Franklin Roosevelt, but he had a Democratic Congress that rubber stamped just about anything that he wanted. The first thing that Roosevelt had to do was save banking. There had been major bank failures in February before he came into office in March. And so what he did was he closed all the banks for 4 days. If you didn't have any money and your money was in the bank for 4 days, you could not get your money. And the government went out and they examined all the banks, and the only ones that reopened were the ones that were solid. And the Emergency Banking Act gave Roosevelt the power to do this. By reorganizing banks, amazingly, when banks reopened, people actually began to take their money out of their coffee cans and from under their mattresses and out of the backyard and the tomato patch. And actually, people began to put money back in the banks. They felt that banks were safe again, only because of the actions and rhetoric of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, a couple of things that passed also with this Bank Act. The Glass-Steagall Act separated investing and banking. Banks had loaned money for people to put into the stock market, and this is part of the reason of the collapse of the economy. When the stock market crashed, people lost their money and they couldn't pay back the banks, and that's the reason there was bank failures. And so Glass-Steagall separated investing and banking. If you're in the banking business, you can't be in the investing business. If you're in the investing business, you can't be in the banking business. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, insured deposits up to 2,500. Beginning today, it's 250,000. And this oversees banking in the United States. The FDIC comes in and looks at the bank's books and see how solid the bank is. Also, when a bank fails, other banks take over the deposits of the failing bank. So you don't have as much problems today with bank failures because of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Big Blue, as it was called, the National Industry Recovery Act, the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, the National Industry Recovery Act, created the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. Part of this was the Public Works Administration, which was to build roads and bridges. Public Works, again, Jacob Coxey's idea, create jobs with printed money. The National Recovery Administration was to restore industrial jobs. It set industrial codes of how industries are supposed to run. It set weekly hours, it set a minimum wage, and outlawed child labor. The NRA was a failure because, one, it did not have no enforcement mechanism to organize unions. It was supposed to help organize unions as well, and it had no enforcement mechanism. Also, the industrial codes were written to help the larger industries, and it killed the smaller industries in certain businesses. And this created actually more unemployment. And industrial production actually decreased under the NRA. And finally, the Supreme Court in Schechter versus the United States was kill the National Recovery Administration. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration put the government in control of farm production. And what it said was it subsidized farmers for turning their crops under. In other words, it tried to create scarcity and keep farm prices high, keep from overproduction on the farm. If you had too much wheat, the government would pay you to turn under so many acres of wheat to keep it off the market. Same thing with corn and cotton. This actually helped the large farmer, but hurt the small farmer, the tenant farmer, and the sharecropper. And the Supreme Court ruled that the government cannot control farm production, and so the Supreme Court declared this unconstitutional as well. The TVA had been an idea all the way back in the 1910s. It had never been finished. But putting a dam on the Tennessee River, Muscle Shoal, Tennessee, first of all, it flooded several towns and much farmland. But the TVA created cheap electricity for that area and created more jobs in the long run for an area. And the TVA, not only Tennessee, but you're talking about parts of Mississippi, North Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina. It provides electricity throughout the large area of southeastern part of the United States. The TVA also helped the farmers in that area to mechanize, or not mechanize farm, but to help them improve their farming methods to increase farm production in that region as well. The Civilian Conservation Corps was to take young men off the streets and unemployed off the rural areas, and they were sent to camps, like military camps, to clean forest and to build roads, and they lived in camps. If you've ever been to Laura Walker State Park, that was a CCC camp. Those old buildings at Laura Walker were barracks for the CCC men, young men that worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps. The road that's built from US 1 to where the Swamp Park is today was built by the CCC. This map gives you the extent of what where the TVA provides electricity. Great portion of Tennessee, parts of North Carolina, North Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and even into Kentucky. These are just some of the programs that were created during the New Deal. Federal emergency relief, giving money to states to help with charity work and government money. But the government money for no work was not enough. It was just not enough money. The CWA put 4 million people to work building roads, bridges, and buildings. The Farm Credit Administration, which is still with us today, made farm loans to farmers to try to help bail out farmers that were being foreclosed on. The Homeowners Loan Corporation made home loans, and the Federal Housing Administration, which is still with us today, gave money for new housing construction, give loans for mortgages for new housing construction. These are some of the New Deal programs in Three of these are still with us and very important today. One is the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, which regulates investments, stocks, and bonds. One of the great causes of the Great Depression was people setting up dummy companies, selling stocks that were worthless, people putting their money in that, losing their money. The Securities and Exchange Commission, if you're going to sell stocks and bonds, you're going to be regulated by the SEC. Whether you're a company, whether you're a broker, the SEC overlooks investments in the United States, and you do not want to run afoul of the SEC. Social Security was created to help older people with a pension, to give older people something when they got to the point they could not work. They would have some money. Everyone has a Social Security card today. Social Security is still with us, even today. The Works Progress Administration replaced the old PWA, which was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and it built roads and buildings. Picture upper part of the slide shows working on a road. The Blackshear Post Office, which is the picture on the right, was built by the WPA. If you go to Manor, the school in Manor was built by the WPA. The old library on Valdosta State campus was built by the WPA and dedicated by Eleanor Roosevelt. She came and cut the ribbon on the day of dedication of the library at Valdosta State. The City Auditorium in Waycross, which is down on the corner of Oak Street in Waycross near the police department, is built by the WPA. And thank goodness it was in bad condition a few years ago, roof falling in, and thank goodness Mayor Phillips and the City Council sought funds to renovate and put the City Auditorium back in usable shape. And it is a beautiful example of the WPA building. A City Auditorium in Waycross, very historical. Elvis Presley appeared there. Joe Louis fought in the City Auditorium in Waycross, and it's a good thing they saved it. When Franklin Roosevelt came to office, 1/3 of rural America were still using kerosene lamps, still getting the water out of the well with a bucket. There was no electricity in rural America for over 1/3 of it. And one thing is, many rural areas were not profitable for big, large companies like the Duke Company to go out and to electrify rural America. The Rural Electrification Administration, many of you may be on REA, you may get your electricity through REA, created co-ops throughout the United States to help electrify rural areas for a non-profit. The REA does not make a profit, and when you are on REA, you are a part owner of the company, whether it be Okefenokee, whether it be Slash Pine, whatever the REA company is, you're a part owner of the REA. So the REA is very much part of us still today. Well, not everybody liked the New Deal. There was opposition to the New Deal. The conservatives believed it was too socialist, it was too communist, it was too much government control. The liberals complained on the left that it did not help women and minorities enough, or it did not control business enough. It didn't control banking or railroads or enough. One of the greatest critics and one of the greatest characters of this period of time is Huey P. Long, the governor of Louisiana, and also the senator from Louisiana. Huey Long said that he believed in sharing our wealth plan, to tax the rich and give it to the poor. And he planned on running against Roosevelt in '36, but Huey P. Long was cut down by assassin's bullets actually, in the state capitol building in Baton Rouge in 1935. a son of a dentist, that Huey P. Long had his license taken away, shot Huey P. Long as he was coming down the corridor between the House and the Senate of the Louisiana legislature. Charles Coughlin was a Catholic priest and an early radio preacher. And he wanted to nationalize banks and issue greenbacks. That was his solution to the Great Depression. Coughlin is going to oppose World War II and our involvement in World War II, and finally the Catholic Church is going to pull the plug on his radio program. Dr. Francis Townsend was a California physician, and he believed that every person over 60 years old should be given a $200 a month pension if they would retire from working, and they had to spend the $200 every month. They just couldn't put it in savings or invest it. They had to spend it every month. The Wagner Act of 1935 created the National Labor Relations Board, and this gave power to unions to organize. Now, the NRA had tried to do that, but it was found unconstitutional. So the Wagner Act is going to finally put some teeth in allowing unions to organize. You can't fire someone for just trying to organize a union. And it tried to end unfair labor practices. The Fair Labor Standards Act of '38 replaced also the programs and policies that the NRA had tried to create for the United States, of minimum wage, of child labor laws. The Fair Labor Act of '38 finally sets, once and for all, a maximum hours for work week at 40 hours plus 4 hours overtime. And you have to be paid for overtime. It set a minimum wage at 25 cents. The bill originally had 40 cents in it, but Southern congressmen said that was just too much, that people in the South could not pay 40 cents an hour, and so it was set back at 25 cents. Also, it finally put a child labor law in that is still in existence today. There have been a couple attempts at child labor laws and found unconstitutional, but finally we have a minimum wage in America in '38 and prohibited child or children working in hazardous jobs or children working under certain ages. During this election year, you're hearing a lot about court packing. Seems like that one party is upset about the last three appointees to the Supreme Court, and they're talking about adding more justices, or what's called court packing. Well, this is not a new idea. It goes back to Franklin Roosevelt. The Supreme Court had found unconstitutional the NRA and the AAA. And Roosevelt was really afraid that the Supreme Court was going to kill Social Security and other New Deal programs. So he goes on radio and he offers this Judicial Procedures Reform Act of 1937. He says there are a lot of older people on the court. 4 of them were over 70. And he said they're overworked and they need help to this workload that they have at the Supreme Court. And we need to appoint one judge for everyone that's over 70, which at that time would be 4. Roosevelt really wanted 4 people on the court that would counter these 4 older ones that were voting against his New Deal programs. He wanted 4 of his people on there. And so this court packing plan that FDR was offering up was not to help these older men with their jobs. It was to help Franklin Delano Roosevelt to ensure his New Deal was not found unconstitutional. Well, why didn't FDR's court packing plan ever come into law? Well, there was opposition, and of course the Republicans opposed it. That goes without saying. But the Democrats, his own vice president, John Nance Gardner, opposed it. And the number one senator on the Judicial Committee, head of the Judicial Committee, was Henry Ashurst, and he opposed it. And they began to say, Franklin was asking for too much power. And many of them said, one day the Democrats may not be in power, and you're going to give the Republicans opportunity to pack the court one day if we pass this. Fortunately, some peace was made between the Supreme Court and FDR. The Supreme Court upheld the minimum wage bill 5-4. They also upheld the Wagner Act about unions being able to organize 5-4. And a couple of the old men, the 70-year-old men, retired, giving FDR a chance to appoint two of his that would counter the other old two. By 1937, the national income had rebounded, and FDR decided it was time to balance the budget. He had ran up the deficits in order to pay for things like the CCC and the AAA and all the different programs. And so he tried to rein in the deficit by cutting spending, and that created a recession. Industrial production decreased, unemployment went back up to nearly 20%, and so Roosevelt had a recession of 37. And this is why many people say the New Deal did not bail us out of the Great Depression. FDR went back to Congress, asked more money for public works, and that's when the WPA came into existence. After 1938, the Southern Democrats, who had never been very favorable of the New Deal, began to vote against anything that Roosevelt wanted. And there were more Republicans in Congress, and with the Southern Democrats and the Republicans, they killed any new proposals by Roosevelt. Also, we had a world crisis looming with the rise of Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy. The World War II was looming ever so closely to the scene. And so with the world crisis looming, the New Deal had to take a back burner. What's been the result of the New Deal? Well, one thing is big government. Government now regulates the economy. It regulates business through the SEC, with the stock market, with companies. The FDIC regulates banking. So all the regulations on business. We also believe that big government can solve all of our problems. We look to government solving our problems instead of we trying to solve our problems or industry and business solving our problems. The government solve our problems. Also, we look to the government for entitlements, Social Security, and later on we're going to add more entitlement programs that we'll talk about under Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. The powerful presidency. The presidency had not always been that powerful. They were supposed to be a balance between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. With Franklin Roosevelt, the presidency became more powerful than the other two branches, and it still is today. We have a new Democratic Party. It's the Democratic Party of the African American vote. The African Americans had voted Republican because that was the party of Lincoln, the great emancipator. They had voted Populist when the People's Party was existed in the West and the South, but when the Populist Party was gone, they went back to the Republican Party because it had been the party of liberation. But now the Democratic Party become the party of the African American vote. And for the first time, labor, the worker, the union worker, the common worker, had a party to latch on to, and that is the Democratic Party.